Some children learn early that the world doesn't owe them kindness. Silas Brennan was one of those children. At 11 years old, he knew hunger like an old friend. He knew the sharp sting of a hand across his face. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a settlement that barely tolerated his existence. He was the boy who mucked the stalls, the one who slept on straw, the one who ate scraps. But what Silas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that in 7 days, 400 Apache warriors would surround this tiny settlement. They would line the ridges, silent as death. And they would be asking for him, by name. What they would do when they found him, and what he had done to summon them, would change everything anyone thought they understood about mercy, honor, and the kind of debts that bind one soul to another, even in death. It started with the sun hanging low between the pines, bleeding red into the sky. Silas knelt by the creek, the cold water numbing his fingers as he filled a dented metal canteen. The canteen belonged to Abner Cole, the man who owned the stable and, for all intents and purposes, owned Silas. His hands shook, not from the cold. The day was still warm. They shook from the certainty that he had already been gone too long. Abner Cole didn't tolerate delays. He didn't tolerate much of anything, really. Except work done fast and work done silent. A minute late with the water meant a minute less of supper. The water ran clear over the smooth stones, and Silas watched it swirl for just a second longer than he should have. It was a tiny rebellion. A moment of peace he was stealing for himself. That's when he heard it. A sound that did not belong in the forest. It wasn't the crack of a branch under a deer's hoof. It wasn't the rustle of wind through the high needles. It was a low, wet rasp, like breath being dragged over broken glass. Silas froze. The canteen, forgotten, slipped from his hand, spilling its precious water back into the creek. He didn't notice. His heart hammered against his ribs. The sound came again, this time from deeper in the trees, past the wild berry bushes that marked the line between settlement land and the true wilderness. Every person in this settlement, even a boy as young as Silas, had heard the stories. Aunt Hattie, the woman who'd taken him in after his parents died and then given him to Abner for his keep, crossed herself whenever anyone even mentioned the tribes. Apache raids, scalped families, burnt cabins. The stories were whispered around fires, told to scare children into behaving, but everyone knew they were true. Silas should have run. He should have grabbed the canteen, forgotten the spilled water, and raced back to the relative safety of Abner's stable without ever looking back. That's what a smart person would do. But the sound came a third time. It was weaker now, a guttural hitching sound, and something in it stopped him cold. It wasn't the sound of a threat. It was the sound of something dying. Against every instinct for survival that Abner Cole had beaten into him, Silas took a step toward the trees. Then another. He moved like a shadow, his worn-out boots barely disturbing the carpet of pine needles. He was good at being quiet, good at being invisible. It was the only skill he had that kept him safe. 50 paces in, where the trees grew thick and dark, he saw him. The man was lying on his back, propped up against a fallen log. One arm was thrown across his chest, the other stretched out, fingers clawing at the dirt. Blood had soaked through his buckskin shirt. It was dark, almost black, and it was spreading. Silas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Deep claw marks, 4 of them, ran parallel from the man's shoulder down his neck and across his chest. The flesh was torn open. A lion, or maybe a bear. Something big, something furious. The man was Apache. There was no mistaking it. Intricate beadwork decorated his clothing. A single black feather was woven into his long hair, which was matted with blood and dirt. Even broken and bleeding out onto the forest floor, there was something powerful about him. Something that made Silas feel small in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He should have left. This was the enemy. This was the man the stories warned him about. If anyone found him here, they'd assume he was a traitor. Abner would do worse than beat him. But the man's lips moved. He was whispering words Silas couldn't understand, his voice a dry rattle. His hand twitched, as if reaching for help that would never, ever come. Silas took a step closer, then another. He was 10 feet away, then 5. The warrior's eyes snapped open. They were dark and impossibly alert, even through the haze of pain. They locked onto Silas's face, and the boy froze like a rabbit in a snare. For a long, long moment, neither of them moved. The forest was silent, holding its breath. Then the man spoke again. His voice was barely a whisper, the words rolling in a language that sounded like wind through high canyon walls. "I don't understand," Silas whispered back. His own voice surprised him, small and hollow in the vast silence. The warrior's hand lifted, trembling with the effort. He gestured weakly toward his own mouth. Then he pointed at Silas. He pointed at the canteen Silas was still clutching, the one he'd picked up without even realizing it. Water. He wanted water. Silas's mind raced. He glanced back toward the settlement, just visible through the trees. If Abner found out. If anyone found out he'd been near an Apache, let alone helped one. He wouldn't just be thrown out. They'd probably hang him. But when he looked back at the dying man, he saw something in those dark eyes. Something he recognized. It was the same thing he saw in his own reflection when he passed the water trough in the stable yard. Loneliness. The kind of absolute bottom-of-the-well loneliness that knows it will die alone, and that no one in the world will mark its passing. Silas walked forward. He knelt beside the warrior and, with a shaking hand, lifted the canteen to the man's lips. The man drank in desperate, choking gulps. Water spilled down his chin, mixing with the blood on his chest. He drank until the canteen was nearly empty. When he finished, his hand shot out. He gripped Silas's wrist. The strength in that hand was terrifying. It was like a steel trap. Silas cried out, trying to pull away, but the grip was absolute. The warrior pulled him closer, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce energy. He spoke again, his voice urgent, desperate. The words poured out of him, a torrent of sound Silas couldn't understand. It was a warning. It felt like a warning. Then, as quickly as it came, the strength fled. The man's grip loosened, his hand fell away, and his eyes closed again. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp. Silas scrambled back, his heart hammering. The man was dying. Maybe he had hours, maybe less. The water had bought him minutes, nothing more. And there was nothing a boy with empty pockets and dirty hands could do about it, except... The thought came quietly, almost without permission. Abner kept milk in the cold cellar. Fresh milk, delivered that morning from the Patterson farm. It was meant for the horse's mash, a special treat for a new stallion Abner was trying to impress. But it was milk. Rich, nourishing. Maybe. Maybe it was enough to give a dying man one more day. Silas looked down at the Apache warrior one more time. He saw the blood, the torn flesh, the enemy. But he also saw the man, the one who was dying alone in the woods. Silas turned and ran. He didn't run back to the settlement to report what he'd found. He didn't run to fetch help or sound an alarm. He ran to steal milk for the enemy everyone told him had no soul. And somewhere in the far distance, though he couldn't possibly have known it, 400 warriors had already begun their march. They were moving silent and fast, and they were looking for their chief's lost son. The cold cellar smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. Silas pressed himself against the wooden doorframe, his ear to the wood. He listened for Abner's heavy, angry footsteps in the stable above. Nothing. Just the creak of old timber and the distant sound of a horse shifting in its stall. He had maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes before Abner would come looking for him, roaring about the water, ready to cuff him for taking so long. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. There it was. The milk jug sat on a low stone shelf, beaded with condensation, fresh from the Patterson farm. Silas's hands trembled as he reached for it. This wasn't like taking an extra biscuit, a crime that earned a slap. This was stealing. This was taking something valuable, something that belonged to Abner's prized stallion. The last boy who'd worked here, a kid named Thomas, had been caught taking an apple. Abner had thrown him out with nothing but the clothes on his back. In the middle of winter. Silas had nowhere else to go. This stable, this life of beatings and hunger, was all he had. But the image of those dark eyes, filled with that terrible, familiar loneliness, wouldn't leave his mind. He grabbed the heavy jug and a small tin cup. He tucked them under his thin shirt, the cold jug pressing against his ribs. He climbed the cellar stairs, his heart pounding so loud he was sure Abner could hear it. He pushed the door open a crack, peered into the stable. Empty. He slipped out, heading for the back door. Just as his hand touched the latch, a voice cut through the air like a whip. "Where in blazes have you been, boy?" Silas spun around. The milk jug felt like a block of ice against his skin. Abner Cole stood in the doorway of the feed room, blocking the light. He was a large man, weathered and hard, with hands that could break a boy's arm as easily as snapping kindling. "The creek, sir," Silas stammered, his mind racing for a lie. "The water. It was low. I had to walk upstream, to the deep pool." Abner's eyes narrowed. He stalked forward, his shadow falling over Silas. The man's gaze was sharp, and it lingered on the strange bulge under Silas's shirt. "Low, was it?" Abner grunted. "Took you long enough." He reached out a hand, and Silas flinched, bracing for the blow. But Abner's hand just brushed against Silas's shirt. "What you got there, boy? Hiding something?" "Nothing, sir. Just what?" Abner's fingers grazed the cold, wet jug. His eyes widened, first in confusion, then in a dark, simmering rage. "You!" Abner began, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Just then, the main stable door burst open. Reverend Hayes stood there, his face flushed. "Abner! Quick! Patterson's mare is down, looks like colic. He needs your help." Abner's head snapped toward the Reverend. He glared at the man, then back at Silas, his jaw working. The interruption had saved Silas, but only for a moment. "We'll finish this later, boy," Abner snarled, his voice low. "Get those stalls mucked before sundown, or you'll sleep outside with the dogs, and I will find out what you're hiding." "Yes, sir," Silas breathed, his knees weak. Abner turned and stalked out, his heavy boots striking the ground. Silas exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. He waited until both men were gone, their voices fading toward the Patterson farm. Then he ran. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows longer and more threatening. He found the spot easily. He'd memorized every tree, every rock. The warrior lay exactly as he'd left him. For a terrible second, Silas thought he was too late. The man was so still. Then he saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Still alive. Barely. "I brought something," Silas whispered, his voice shaking. He knelt beside the man and poured the rich white milk into the tin cup. He gently lifted the warrior's head and held the cup to his lips. The warrior's eyes opened, slowly. They focused on Silas's face with an intensity that made the boy feel exposed, like every thought, every secret, was being read and understood. The man drank. He drank slowly this time, savoring it. When the cup was empty, Silas filled it again. After the second cup, a little color seemed to return to the man's face. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, but his breathing seemed a fraction deeper. He spoke again, in that rolling, incomprehensible language. This time he lifted his hand and pressed it against his own chest. Then he pointed at Silas and pressed his hand over the boy's heart. I don't know what you're saying," Silas whispered. The warrior tried again. His voice was urgent, despite its weakness. He pointed toward the west, toward the mountains that were barely visible through the trees. Then he made a gesture with his hand, fingers spreading wide, moving in a wave. "Many," he said, in a broken, accented word. "English." Silas stared. "Many?" The man nodded, his brow furrowed with effort. "Many people." He pressed his own chest again. Then he reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched Silas's face with a surprising gentleness. Are you trying to tell me something about your people?" Silas asked, his heart sinking. "Are they coming?" The man's eyes filled with something that looked like desperation. He gripped Silas's wrist, pulling him closer. He spoke rapidly now, words tumbling over each other, a mix of his own language and broken English. "Listen, boy. Listen." But his strength gave out. He collapsed back against the log, his breathing ragged. He'd used up all his energy. Silas stayed with him until the light began to fade, until the shadows grew too deep to ignore. He knew he had to go back. Abner would be waiting. He carefully hid the heavy milk jug and the tin cup beneath a fallen log, covering them with leaves. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, though he knew the man might not understand. "I promise." As he ran back toward the settlement, the forest behind him seemed to hold its breath. And in the stable that night, Abner Cole stood in the cellar doorway, staring at the empty space on the stone shelf. He had returned from the Patterson farm to find the milk jug gone. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Someone was stealing from him, and it was the boy. He knew it. He didn't need proof, but he'd get it. The boy thought he'd been careful, but Abner was smarter. He found the half-full jug under the log on his way back. He didn't take it. Instead, he went back to the cellar, took a small pouch of flour, and dusted a fine, almost invisible layer on the stone shelf around where the jug should have been. He would know. Oh, he would know. And when he found out why, there would be consequences. 3 more times Silas made the journey. The first time, he saw the flour. His heart stopped. Abner knew he was setting a trap. Silas stared at the fine, white powder. He could just turn around, put the jug back, take his beating for being late. But then he thought of the warrior. He took the jug anyway. He left tracks. He didn't care. He stole grain from the feed sacks. He brought water from the creek. Each day, the warrior was a little weaker, but he was alive. And each day, his eyes, when they opened, held a fierce intelligence, a desperate need to communicate. He kept repeating the hand-to-heart gesture. He kept pointing west. "Many people," he'd rasp. "Naichi." It was on the 4th day that Reverend Hayes rode through the settlement, ringing the warning bell. Silas was mucking stalls, his shoulders aching, when he heard it. That harsh, clanging sound that meant only one thing. Danger. He dropped the pitchfork and ran to the main road. People were already gathering, their faces pale. "Apache signs!" the Reverend announced, his voice cracking. "On the northern ridge, tracks, fresh ones, at least a dozen horses, maybe more." A woman cried out, "Everyone needs to stay close to town." The Reverend shouted over the growing panic. "No one goes into the forest. Not for any reason. Lock your doors tonight." Silas felt his stomach drop. His secret, which had felt heavy before, now felt like a block of lead. If they found out he'd been going into the forest every day, if they discovered what he'd been doing, boy. Abner's voice cut through his thoughts. The man's face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He knew. He'd seen the disturbed flour. He'd seen the milk level drop. He just didn't know why. Not yet. "Get back to work," Abner said, his voice quiet. "And if I catch you even looking at those trees, you'll answer for it. I promise you that." Silas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He returned to the stable, but his mind was racing. He couldn't go back. It was too risky, but the warrior, Naichi, he was dying. Without food, without water, he wouldn't last another day. He was trapped. That night, Silas waited. He waited until Abner's snoring rattled the thin walls of the stable house. He waited until the moon hung thin and pale, casting barely enough light to see. He slipped out through the back window of the stable, landing silently in the dirt. He ran. He ran through the darkness, his feet finding the path by memory alone. He stumbled over roots, scraped his hands on rocks, but he didn't slow down. When he reached the clearing, he almost cried out in relief. The warrior was still. Too still. "Naichi," Silas whispered, creeping forward. A terrible, cold fear gripped him. He was too late. The man was gone. Then the warrior's eyes opened. They were clouded, the fire almost gone. But he was alive. Silas saw the truth in them. This was the last time. There would be no tomorrow. He knelt and offered water from the canteen. The warrior drank only a little, then pushed the cup away with a weak hand. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched Silas's face. When he spoke, his voice was a dry whisper, but there was a terrible urgency in every syllable. He pointed west. He made the spreading gesture. Many people. Then he touched his own chest. "Naichi," he whispered. He repeated it 3 times. "Naichi, Naichi, Naichi." He was telling Silas his name. "Naichi," Silas repeated softly. "The warrior." "Naichi." Managed a small, weak smile. Then his expression changed. It became serious, pleading. He grabbed Silas's hand and pressed it against his own chest, over his heart. Then he took Silas's other hand and pressed it hard against the boy's own chest. He spoke again, longer this time. The words flowed like a prayer or a promise or a final confession. Silas understood none of it, but tears burned in his eyes anyway. Naichi's grip loosened. His hand fell to his side, his eyes closed, and between one breath and the next, he was gone. Silas sat there for a long time, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. He held the hand of a man whose language he didn't speak, whose people he'd been taught to fear. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had watched a person die, a person who had tried so hard with his last breaths to tell him something about many people coming, something about hearts connected. He couldn't leave him here, not like this. Using his bare hands and a flat stone, Silas began to dig. It took hours. The ground was hard, full of roots. By the time he was finished, his fingers were raw and bleeding, and his shoulders ached with an exhaustion he'd never known. He gently lowered Naichi's body into the shallow grave. He laid him flat, his arms crossed over his chest, just as he'd seen them do for Old Man Hemlock when he'd passed. He covered him with soil, then with pine needles. He found flat stones in the creek bed and arranged them in a circle around the spot, marking it. He wanted to be able to find it again. He placed a few smooth, white river rocks in the center, pointing west, toward the mountains Naichi had pointed to. It felt right. As the first pale light of dawn broke through the trees, Silas stood over the grave, hollowed out, exhausted. He had done the only thing he could. He had given a dying man dignity. He had kept him from dying completely alone. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that those carefully arranged stones formed a pattern, a message, one that would be read by eyes far sharper than his own. He had just given the Apache Nation a map. He had told them exactly where their lost warrior was buried, and he had just signed his own death warrant, or so he thought. 6 days passed like a slow death. Silas went through the motions. He mucked stalls. He hauled water. He avoided Abner's eyes. But his mind stayed in that clearing, with those stones, and the weight of a secret he couldn't share. At night, he dreamed of Naichi's eyes, urgent and desperate, trying to tell him something. Abner watched him. The man didn't say a word about the milk. He didn't say a word about the flour. He just watched, his eyes cold and calculating. He was waiting, letting the rope tighten. On the 7th morning, he found his moment. Silas was in the feed room, bagging oats. Abner blocked the only door. "You think I'm stupid, boy?" The man's voice was quiet. That was always worse. Silas's mouth went dry. He shook his head. "I've been tracking that milk jug. Every few days it goes down. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough for a thief who thinks he's clever." I don't know what." Abner's hand shot out. He grabbed Silas's shirt, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the wall. The bags of oats toppled over. "Don't you lie to me," Abner roared, his face purple. "Where did it go? Who were you giving it to?" "No one. Were you selling it? Trading it for trinkets?" "No, sir. I would never." "Then where?" Abner shook him, rattling his teeth. "You've been sneaking off. Into the woods. The same woods the Reverend warned us about. The woods full of Apache." Abner's eyes widened, a horrible, dawning realization spreading across his features. "My God," he breathed. You've been meeting them, feeding them. You traitorous little rat." "No, it wasn't like that. He?" Abner's fist drew back. "You've brought them down on us, haven't you? That's what this is." Before Silas could answer, before Abner's fist could land, someone screamed. It was a high, terrified sound. It came from outside. Abner froze, his fist still raised. He released Silas, who slumped to the floor, gasping. Abner ran toward the door. "Stay here," he snarled. Silas didn't listen. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering, and followed. He burst into the stable yard just as the whole settlement seemed to be running toward the main road. People were pointing toward the northern ridge, the ridge where the forest met the sky. Silas looked, and his blood turned to ice. Standing along the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun, were riders. Dozens of them. No, more than dozens. They lined the entire length of the ridge, still as statues, their long spears pointing toward the heavens. Apache. "Get inside!" someone shouted. "Get the children! Bar the doors!" Chaos erupted. People ran in every direction, screaming. Mothers grabbed their children. Men rushed for rifles they hadn't fired in years. Reverend Hayes was trying to restore order, shouting prayers that nobody could hear over the panic. Silas stood frozen in the stable yard, staring at those distant, silent figures. They'd come. The many people Naichi warned him about. They had come. And somehow, deep in his bones, he knew. They had come for him. "How many?" a man yelled, his voice cracking. Someone raised a spyglass, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it steady. I count. I count at least 200, maybe more. Oh God, they're everywhere. 200. The number rippled through the crowd like a poison. The settlement had maybe 40 men who could shoot. 40 against 200. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. But the warriors didn't attack. They just sat on their horses, perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. "Why aren't they moving?" someone whispered. "What are they waiting for?" Reverend Hayes stepped forward, his face pale but his jaw set. "Maybe they want to talk. Maybe they're not here for—" A new sound cut him off. Hoofbeats. Not from the ridge. From the east road. Silas turned. His heart stopped. Another line of warriors. These ones closer, moving in perfect, terrifying formation. They stopped 100 yards from the settlement's edge, forming a wall of horseflesh and iron. "Behind us!" another voice screamed. Silas spun around. The south ridge. It was lined now, too. And when he looked west, toward the mountains Naichi had pointed to, even more. They had surrounded the entire settlement. "They've boxed us in," Abner breathed, his rifle shaking in his grip. We're trapped." The crowd pressed together, a knot of terrified people in the center of the town square. Women wept silently. Men checked their weapons, their faces gray. And still, the warriors didn't attack. They just waited. The silence was louder than any war cry. Then, a single rider broke from the northern group. He rode down the ridge, slow and deliberate. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a long spear decorated with black feathers. When he reached the edge of the settlement, just out of rifle range, he stopped. His voice rang out, clear and strong. He spoke in accented but perfect English. "We seek the boy," he called. Every heart in the settlement stopped. The one with hair like burnt grass. The one with hands that carry mercy. Every head in the town square turned, looking, searching, looking for Silas. Silas couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His legs had turned to stone, hair like burnt grass. That was what his mother used to call his dusty, straw-colored hair. All around him, people stared, confused at first. Then, the confusion turned to a dawning, terrible understanding. "You," Abner breathed. His voice was a low hiss of pure venom. He stalked toward Silas, his face a mask of rage and fear. "You," he repeated. "The milk. Sneaking into the forest. The Apache." He grabbed Silas by the front of his shirt, lifting him onto his toes. "What did you do?" he roared, his spit flying in Silas's face. Before Silas could answer, Reverend Hayes grabbed Abner's arm. "Abner, no, boy. If you know something about this, you need to speak. Now. All our lives depend on it." Silas opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain? How could he make them understand he'd only tried to help a dying man? That he hadn't known? "He's brought them down on us," a woman screamed from the crowd. "That's why they're here. The boy brought death to our door." "Give him to them!" another man shouted, his eyes wild with terror. "It's him they want. Let them have him. Maybe they'll leave the rest of us alone." The crowd surged forward, anger replacing fear. They were a mob now. "Let them have him!" Hands reached for Silas, grabbing at his thin clothes, his arms. "No!" Reverend Hayes shouted, trying to hold them back, but there were too many. They were desperate. "He's the one. Give him to them." Abner, seeing his chance, sneered. "It's what he deserves. He's a thief and a traitor." He raised his hand to strike Silas, to throw him to the mob. "Stop!" The voice cracked across the settlement like a peal of thunder. Everyone froze. The Apache rider who had spoken before had dismounted. He now stood at the edge of town, his spear planted in the ground. Behind him, the wall of warriors remained motionless, but the threat in their stillness was absolute. "The boy comes forward by choice," the rider said, his voice cold and flat. "He is not dragged. He is not forced. He walks on his own feet." He paused, and his eyes swept over the terrified crowd. "Or we take him, and everyone else." Silence. Absolute terrifying silence. Slowly the hands released Silas. The crowd stepped back. They created a path, an empty space between the boy and the waiting warriors, a path that looked like a walk to an altar of sacrifice. Silas stood alone in that empty space, trembling so hard his teeth chattered. This was it. He was going to die. They were going to torture him, make him pay for touching one of their warriors, for burying him, for getting it wrong. But then he thought of Naichi's eyes, the way they'd softened when he'd given him the milk, the way his hand had pressed over Silas's heart, trying to communicate something important. If he ran, they'd kill everyone. If he went, maybe, just maybe, the others would be spared. He took one step, then another. His legs shook, but they carried him. He walked past Abner's accusing stare. He walked past the Reverend's helpless, pitying expression. He walked past all the people who had never wanted him, never valued him, who were now hiding behind him, praying he would save them. When he reached the Apache rider, the man studied him with dark, unreadable eyes. "You are the one," the man said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what I did wrong," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "But please don't hurt them. They didn't know. It was just me." The rider's expression didn't change. He turned and spoke in his own language, a series of sharp commands that rippled across the waiting warriors. Then he gestured for Silas to follow. They walked away from the settlement toward the northern ridge. With every step, Silas expected an arrow in his back, a blade across his throat. But nothing came. Just the sound of hoofbeats behind them as 24 warriors fell in, a silent, deadly escort. At the ridge's crest, Silas finally saw what the settlement couldn't note. The full scope of what had come for him. Warriors covered the landscape like a dark sea. Hundreds. Easily 400, maybe more. They stretched in every direction, a force that could wipe the settlement off the map without breaking a sweat. And in the center of that sea, mounted on a magnificent paint horse, sat a man who radiated authority like heat from a fire. He wore the full, feathered headdress of a war chief, the feathers cascading down his back. His face was a map of weathered lines, and his eyes were sharp as broken glass. When those eyes found Silas, the boy felt pinned in place, like a butterfly on a board. The rider beside Silas spoke, his voice now respectful, almost awed. "This is Cochetta, war chief of the Ende, father of Naichi, who you found in the forest." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Father. Naichi had been the chief's son, and Silas had watched him die. Cochetta dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age. He stood before Silas, towering over the boy. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing. He just studied him. Those sharp, penetrating eyes seemed to see straight through Silas's skin, through his bones, into the trembling, terrified heart beneath. When Cochetta finally spoke, his English carried the weight of mountains. "My son went into the forest to hunt," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was strong, skilled, proud. Cochetta's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. But the mountain lion was stronger. It caught him far from our camp, far from help. His gaze was so intense, Silas couldn't look away. "He knew he would die there," Cochetta continued, "alone, like an animal with no name." Silas's throat constricted. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words were stuck. "For 3 days we searched for him. We found where the lion attacked. We found blood. We found tracks leading deeper into the forest. But we could not find my son." The chief's voice remained steady, but something in his eyes, a deep, cold grief, betrayed the man beneath. "Then our best tracker. He found stones." Cochetta looked at the rider who stepped forward. "The stones were arranged in a pattern," the rider said. "A burial marker. Not our tradition, but a marker nonetheless." He looked at Silas. The stones formed a circle. In the center, smooth river rocks were placed. They were pointing west, toward our territory, toward his home. The rider's voice dropped. "In our tradition, this pattern means respect for a fallen warrior. It means, may his spirit find its way home." Silas felt his chest tighten. He hadn't known. He'd just arranged them, because Naichi had pointed west. "We opened the grave," Cochetta said, his voice flat. Silas flinched. "We found my son. He was laid with respect. His face had been cleaned of blood. Someone had closed his eyes. Someone had given him dignity in his death." The chief's hand moved to his own chest, over his heart. "This is not something your people do for ours," he said, his voice raw. "Not something we have ever seen from those who take our land." Silas finally found his voice. It was small and it cracked. He was suffering. I couldn't leave him there, not like that." "You gave him water," Cochetta said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." And milk. Silas's head snapped up. How? Milk, Cochetta repeated. Rich milk, the kind your people keep for your own. We found the jug. It was hidden. I stole it, Silas whispered, shame and fear mixing. From the man I work for, Abner Cole. I'm sorry. You stole, Cochetta said, his expression shifting. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect. You risked punishment, a beating, to feed a dying enemy. He leaned closer. Why? Silas looked down. He thought about Naichi's eyes. He thought about that moment of recognition, when two souls who had been abandoned by the world found each other in the woods. He looked up, meeting the chief's gaze. He looked at me. The way I feel inside, Silas stammered. Alone, like nobody in the whole world cared if he lived or died. I know what that's like. Silence fell over the ridge. 400 warriors sat on their horses, motionless, and Silas realized with a jolt that every single one of them was listening, waiting. In our tradition, Cochetta said, his voice slow and heavy, when someone saves the life or honors the death of one of our people, a debt is created. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. The weight of it was immense, like a mountain settling onto the boy's bones. A sacred obligation. It must be repaid. You could not save my son's life, the chief continued. That was already beyond any man's power, but you saved something more precious. You saved his honor. You made sure he did not leave this world as forgotten meat for scavengers. The stones you placed, without knowing our ways, spoke a language older than words. You marked his grave. You pointed his spirit home. You honored him as one of our own would have done. Silas's eyes burned. He hadn't known. He hadn't understood. You are 11 years old, Cochetta said. Naichi was 23, a warrior, a leader, my only son. The chief's voice didn't break, but something in it fractured, just the same. And now, I must repay the debt your compassion created. Cochetta's hand remained on Silas's shoulder, steady as stone. Around them, the 400 warriors waited. Even the horses seemed to understand, standing still as carved wood. Among my people, Cochetta said, there is a law older than memory. When a life debt is owed, it must be paid in equal measure. His eyes held Silas's unblinking. You honored my son in his death. You showed mercy when you had every reason to show fear. You gave food from your own mouth, food you had to steal when you yourself were hungry. The chief's gaze swept over Silas's thin frame, his ragged clothes. This debt, it cannot be paid with horses, or weapons, or gold. It can only be paid with what you gave. Heart for heart, honor for honor. Silas didn't understand. His mind was slow, clouded by fear and exhaustion, and the impossible, thundering reality of this moment. I offer you a choice, Cochetta continued, his voice dropping. The first choice, you become my son. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Not in words alone, in truth. You will live among us. You will learn our ways. You will be trained as Naichi would have been trained, everything that would have been his. Respect, position, knowledge. It will be yours. Cochetta's grip tightened. You will never hunger again. You will never be unwanted again. You will be Ailing Apache, one of us. Silas's head swam, adopted, by an Apache chief, given everything, family, belonging, a purpose. He had spent 11 years being nobody, worth nothing. And now, this man, this powerful, terrifying man, was offering him a life beyond anything he could have dreamed. But it meant leaving. It meant never seeing the settlement again. It meant becoming the enemy. The second choice, Cochetta said, and his voice softened just slightly. You name anything else within my power to give, and it is yours. Horses, gold, safe passage for your people, protection from all other raids, from any tribe, whatever you desire. If I can grant it, I will. You name it, and the debt is paid. Anything. The word echoed in Silas's head. He could ask for money, enough to leave the settlement, leave Abner, and start somewhere new. He could ask for horses and just ride away. He could even ask for revenge. He could point at Abner Cole. But as he stood there, the wind pulling at his ragged shirt, he thought about the terror on the faces of the settlers. He thought about how quickly they'd been willing to throw him to the wolves to save themselves. He thought about the years of being invisible, tolerated, but never, ever loved. And then he thought about Naichi. He thought about his final, desperate act, pressing his hand to his own heart and then to Silas's, trying to communicate something. Not a warning, not a threat, a message. I don't know what to choose, Silas whispered. Cochetta nodded slowly. This is wise. A big choice should not be made quickly. He glanced at the rider beside him, then back at Silas. But know this. If you choose to become my son, you choose all that comes with it. Our enemies become your enemies. Our struggles become your struggles. The life is hard, boy, harder than mucking stalls and stealing milk. And if I choose something else, then you return to your people. You take with you whatever you have asked for, and the debt is paid. We will ride from this place and never return. Silas looked down at the settlement. From this height it looked so small, so fragile. He could see the tiny figures of the settlers still clustered in the square, watching, waiting to see if they would live or die, based on what a boy they'd never valued would say. The weight of all those lives pressed down on him, his people, who had shown him nothing but hardship, and Cochetta's people, who had traveled for days to honor a debt to a child. Can I ask you something first? Silas said quietly. Cochetta inclined his head. Speak. Silas took a breath. It felt like it might be his last. The question was dangerous, maybe foolish, but it was the only one that mattered. When Naichi was dying, he said, his voice stronger now, he kept pointing at his heart, and then at my heart. Silas met the chief's gaze, man to man, boy to chief. Do you think that's what he meant? That even though we're different, we're the same underneath? Cochetta was silent for a long, long time. The wind whistled over the ridge. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion Silas couldn't name. My son, Cochetta said, was wise beyond his years. Yes, boy, I believe that is exactly what he meant. A tear tracked its way through the grime on Silas's face. Then I know what I want to ask for. The chief waited. The warriors waited. The world waited. Teach them, Silas said, and he pointed. Not at Abner, not at the horses. He pointed down at the settlement. Teach my people that not all Apache are enemies. Show them what I learned, that you have honor, that you value life, that you're not the monsters they think you are. His voice grew stronger, filled with a sudden, impossible fire. And let me teach your people the same thing, that not every settler wants to take from you, that some of us just want to live without fear. The silence that followed was so complete, Silas could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. 400 warriors sat motionless. Cochetta's expression was unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. Then, slowly, the chief began to nod. You are a strange child, Silas Brennan, Cochetta said. And for the first time, something that might have been a smile touched his weathered face. You could have asked for wealth, for power, for revenge on the man who hurt you. Instead, you ask for understanding, something that benefits everyone, but yourself. He placed both hands on Silas's shoulders. My son chose well, he said, his voice thick. He chose well when he marked you as worthy of honor." Cochetta turned to face his warriors. He spoke in his own language. His voice was not a shout, but it carried across the ridge a powerful, commanding speech that rolled like thunder. Silas didn't understand a single word, but he understood the response. In perfect, terrifying unison, 400 spears were lifted toward the sky. Then, as one, they were struck against the hard-packed earth. The sound was a single, deafening boom. Agreement. Acceptance. The chief turned back to Silas. He reached up and with steady hands removed a necklace from around his own throat. It was simple but beautiful. A single carved piece of bone strung on a leather cord. It was carved with symbols Silas didn't recognize. "This," Cochetta said, "belonged to Naichi. He wore it from the day he became a warrior. Now it belongs to you." He placed it around Silas's neck. The bone was warm against his skin. "While you wear this," the chief said, his voice dropping to a serious, binding oath, "you walk under the protection of the Ende. No Apache will ever raise a hand against you, or against those you claim as your own." He stepped back. "3 horses, strong ones. They will be brought to your stable. They are yours, to keep or trade. And this promise. While you live, while that necklace remains around your neck, no warrior of mine will raid this settlement. Your people, they will be safe." Tears streamed down Silas's face now. He couldn't stop them, and he didn't try. "Go back to your people," Cochetta said, his voice gentle. "Go back and tell them what happened here today. Tell them that an 11-year-old boy taught a war chief something he had forgotten, that mercy is stronger than hate, and that kindness can change the course of a war." Silas walked down the ridge on legs that felt like jelly. Behind him, 3 magnificent horses were being led by the Apache rider. The necklace was heavy and warm against his chest. When he reached the edge of the settlement, the crowd was still there, frozen in terror. They stared in stunned silence. At the boy they had dismissed, at the horses, at the Apache, who were already in perfect, organized columns, beginning to depart. They were melting back into the mountains, disappearing as silently as they had come. Abner Cole stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion, shame, and lingering, fearful anger. "Boy," he stammered. "Boy, I—" Silas just walked past him. He didn't even look at him. "My name," he said quietly, his voice clear in the silence, "is Silas, and I don't work for you anymore." He walked past them all, past the Reverend, past his Aunt Hattie, past every person who had ever looked through him like he wasn't there. He walked to the edge of town, one of the Apache horses nuzzling his shoulder. He stopped, and he watched the last of the warriors disappear into the distance. For the first time in his entire life, Silas Brennan understood what it meant to belong to something. Not because someone had taken him in out of pity, but because he had earned it. He had earned it with compassion, when compassion was the hardest thing in the world to give. The settlement would never forget the day 400 warriors came for a poor, unwanted boy. And Silas would never forget the moment he learned that the smallest act of kindness can echo across mountains, across cultures, and across generations. The debt had been paid, but the bond it created, that would last forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage meets destiny in the untamed frontier. You won't want to miss what happens next.